A forgotten photograph. A secret buried for decades. A city forced to confront its past. When Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson uncovers a haunting 1940s photo of a black family planting a tree, he ignites a firestorm. Teaming with ex-mayor Lori Lightfoot, he traces the sapling to a gnarled oak, now wrapped in thousands of ribbons, each a silent cry for justice. Their search leads to 90-year-old Edith Hayes, whose father was lynched for daring to grow beauty in a segregated city. But as the truth emerges, so does a chilling link to a powerful family's legacy of lies. From whispered prayers tied to branches to a shocking confession under the tree's shadow, the oak becomes a battleground for redemption. Can a symbol of hate transform into a beacon of hope? Stay tuned to witness how roots of rage become branches of reconciliation. And don't forget to subscribe. Winter had teeth in Chicago that year. It gnawed at the edges of Lake Michigan, frosting the waves into jagged glass, and bit down hard on the skeletal branches of Grant Park's oaks. Mayor Brandon Johnson's breath hung in the air like a ghost as he stood at the edge of the construction site, his wool coat collar turned up against the wind. Crews have been tearing up the park's southern quadrant for weeks, a promised revitalization of playgrounds and picnic areas. But the backhoes had paused at the edge of a gnarled oak, its roots clawing at a patch of earth that refused to surrender to modernity. Johnson had come for the photo op, clipboard in hand, ready to smile for the cameras beside blueprints of swing sets and splash pads. But the ground had other plans. A workman's shout had cut through the mechanical growl of excavators. "Mayor, you gotta see this." And there, cradled in the oak's roots like a child's forgotten secret, lay a rusted tin box, its edges crusted with the dirt of decades. He knelt, ignoring the cold seeping through his slacks. The box was smaller than a shoebox, its once red paint bleached to the color of dried blood. The lid creaked open with a sound like a held breath, releasing the scent of aged paper and damp soil. Inside, curled like a sleeping creature, was a photograph. The image was a study in contrasts. A black man in a suit worn thin at the elbows knelt in the dirt, his hands cradling a sapling no taller than his forearm. Beside him, a girl of maybe 6 pressed her palms into the soil, her braids tied with mismatched ribbons. Her smile was pure light, but the man's eyes, deep set, shadowed, held something heavier. The backdrop was unmistakable, the same oak that now towered above Johnson, its younger self just a fragile thing in the frame. On the photograph's back, cursive script spidered across the yellowed paper, "For Edith. May this tree outlive their hate." November 1943. Johnson's throat tightened. He'd spent a decade teaching history at DuSable High before politics swallowed him whole, drilling into South Side kids that the past wasn't dead. It was buried, waiting for someone to dig. Now here it was, staring back through the eyes of a girl who'd likely grown old in a city that had tried to forget her. The construction crew hovered, uneasy. Cameras clicked, reporters eager to spin the moment into a feel-good headline. Mayor unearths time capsule. But Johnson barely heard them. His thumb brushed the photo's edge, where a fingerprint smudge lingered, oily and ancient. Edith's? Or her father's? Pressing this memory into the dark for someone to find? That night, in his office overlooking the loop's neon grid, Johnson spread maps across his desk. The Oak's location now was a vacant lot near Bronzeville's old rail yards, a place where the city's bones poked through, crumbling brownstones, sidewalks cracked by stubborn weeds. Google Earth showed the tree as a gnarled sentinel, its trunk wrapped in pale fragments that glowed like scars in the satellite image. Ribbons? Plastic? The resolution blurred the truth. He thought his grandmother, born just a decade after Edith, how she'd hung her wash in Bronzeville's courtyards, humming hymns as trains rattled past. They called it the Black Metropolis, she told him once, her voice bittersweet. But metropolis ain't nothing but a fancy word for a place they let us build till they wanted it back. Rain hissed against the windows. Johnson opened a browser, typing Elijah Hayes, Chicago 1943, into the search bar. The screen flickered, Obituaries, census records, a faded Defender article about a disturbance near 43rd and Princeton. No photos. Novedades. A knock shattered the silence. Lori Lightfoot stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the fluorescence. Even out of office, she carried herself like a woman who'd never stopped wearing power suits. Her gaze dropped to the photograph on his desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, though her tone lacked its usual bite. Johnson turned the photo toward her. Lightfoot's breath caught, a tiny, human sound he'd never heard from her before. "Elijah Hayes," she murmured, more to herself than him. "My granddaddy mentioned him. Botanist, right? Worked with the WPA during the Depression. They said he disappeared." Disappeared how? Lightfoot's laugh was a dry thing. Same way black men always did back then. Wrong place, wrong skin. She traced the photo's edge, her finger pausing at the sapling. "That tree's still there, isn't it? Near the tracks." "How'd you know?" "Because guilt makes poor fertilizer, but it grows things anyway." Outside, the wind rose, whistling through the skyline's canyons. Somewhere, the oak's branches clattered like bones. The train tracks that sliced through Bronzeville hummed with the memory of steam and steel. Mayor Brandon Johnson walked them now, his shoes crunching gravel still slick from last night's rain. To his left, Lori Lightfoot kept pace, her stride shorter but sharper, as if every step were a blade cutting through the fog of the past. They'd agreed to meet at dawn, avoiding the cameras and aides. Two former adversaries turned reluctant archaeologists of a history the city had paved over. Bronzeville woke slowly. Sunrise gilded the boarded-up windows of the Parkway Ballroom, where Duke Ellington's trumpet once shook the rafters. A stray dog nosed through trash bags piled where the Regal Theater's marquee had promised Ella Fitzgerald live in neon cursive. Johnson paused, squinting at a mural half-hidden under peeling ads for cash loans and bail bonds. Faded blues and golds hinted at a saxophonist mid-note, his face eroded by decades of weather and neglect. Lightfoot traced the outline with a gloved finger. "They called this the Black Metropolis," she said, not turning. "My granddaddy sold insurance 2 blocks over. Told me white bankers would cross the street rather than shake his hand." Her voice was flat, but her eyes burned. The vacant lot appeared suddenly, a missing tooth in the block's crumbling grin. And there it stood, the oak. Time had twisted it into something biblical. Its trunk, thicker than a Cadillac, bore scars that puckered like old bullet wounds. Ribbons fluttered from its branches, faded calico scraps, plastic grocery ties, silk hair bows, each knotted with the desperation of a prayer. Some were so old they'd melted into the bark, becoming veins in the wood. Johnson reached for a recent edition, a yellow Black Lives Matter bandana, its edges frayed by wind. "They've been coming here a long time," Lightfoot said. She crouched, brushing leaves from a patch of soil dotted with stubby candles and whiskey miniatures. An offering or a wake? The Cook County archives smelled of mildew and regret. Lightfoot bullied past a clerk's protests, her old prosecutor's badge flashing like a skeleton key. They were led to a basement room where file boxes slumped like tired sentinels. The public disturbances, 1940 to 1945 folder crumbled at the edges, its contents whispering of fires and fistfights. Then, a memo, typed on paper thin as onion skin. November 12, 1943, 11:47 p.m. Officers dispatched to 43 RD/Princeton Re. Noise complaint. Found group of Negroes, EST 15 to 20, gathered around tree. Group became agitated when ordered to disperse. One male, Elijah Hayes, DOB 1901, resisted arrest. Officer O'Reilly sustained minor injury. Hayes fled scene. No persuto ferais. Johnson's finger hovered over the date. 4 days after the photo in the tin box. Look, Lightfoot slid another document across the table. A coroner's report, stamped confidential. Jundu Negro. Found, November 14th, 1943. Burned tree near 43 RD/Princeton. Code, strangulation. Note, rope fibers embedded in neck tissue. No identificación. Case closed. November 20th, 43. The basement's single bulb flickered. Somewhere, a pipe groaned. Lightfoot's pen tapped the word burned. They lynched him at his own damn tree, then called it a disturbance. Johnson imagined the scene. Elijah's body dangling from the sapling, its tender wood bending under the weight. How long had it taken for the roots to swallow the horror? For the ribbons to start appearing? They emerged into a noon sun that felt too bright, too clean. Lightfoot lit a cigarette, her hand steady but her voice fraying. My granddaddy's journals. He wrote about a botanist friend who taught kids to grow tomatoes in vacant lots. Said the city condemned the gardens as health hazards. Bullshit. They just hated seeing us build anything beautiful. A bus roared past, its sides plastered with Johnson's own face urging renew Chicago. He thought of the park renovation, the backhoes waiting to devour that tin box's resting place. How many other memories lay buried under the city's hunger for progress? At the corner of 43rd and Princeton, a young mother knelt, helping her son tie a blue ribbon around the oak's roots. The boy's fingers fumbled the knot. "For Grandpa?" he asked. "For everyone they couldn't bury right," she murmured. Lightfoot turned away first. Johnson lingered, watching the ribbon flutter, a tiny flag of remembrance in a wind that carried the stench of diesel and the ghost of magnolia blooms from a tree that refused to forget. The house on South Champlain Avenue wore its years like a shroud. Paint peeled from its clapboard walls in gray curls, and the porch sagged under the weight of decades, its steps groaning like an old woman's bones. From her bedroom window, Edith Hayes could just see the crown of the oak tree, its branches clawing at the sky above the rooflines. At 90, her eyesight had dimmed, but she didn't need clarity to know how the ribbons fluttered there, tattered rainbows against the winter-bare limbs. She counted them some mornings, a ritual as ingrained as the ache in her joints. 12 red, 8 blue, 3 yellow. A ledger of sorrows she'd stopped trying to balance long ago. The room smelled of camphor and dust, of photo albums kept shut since Reagan was president. On the dresser, a saucer held hairpins and a single dried magnolia bloom, its edges brittle as ash. The flower had been white once, plucked from her mother's wedding veil the night they buried Elijah in a pauper's field. Edith's fingers brushed its petals now, a habit left from childhood when she'd twist them for luck during thunderstorms. Outside, a city bus wheezed to a stop. Through the glass, she watched a woman in a tan coat climb the porch steps, too young to be a nurse, too determined to be a missionary. Lori Lightfoot's knock echoed like a judge's gavel. Edith didn't rise. Let her wait. Let them all wait. The girl, because even at 60, Lightfoot seemed a girl to her, entered with the cold still clinging to her shoulders. She carried a manila folder thick with ghosts. Edith knew its contents without looking. The photograph from the tin box, the coroner's report, the lies typed neatly under letterhead. "Mrs. Hayes," Lightfoot began, but Edith raised a hand. "Seat." The chair creaked. Lightfoot's gaze darted to the magnolia, the cracked mirror, the Bible on the nightstand splayed open to Psalms. Edith watched her inventory the room, this woman who'd once worn power like armor. Now, she looked hollowed out, as if the past week had scooped her clean. For a long moment, the only sound was the radiator's metallic cough. Then Lightfoot slid the folder onto the bed. The photo stared up, Elijah's hands cradling the sapling, Edith's own 6-year-old grin frozen in monochrome. "Tell me about him," Lightfoot said, softer than Edith expected. She closed her eyes. The past rushed in like smoke. November 1943. The air had tasted of burnt sugar that night. Her father's hands, still smelling of soil from the tree planting, gripped her shoulders too tight. "Hide in the crawl space, Bertie, however long it takes." She'd pressed her face to the floorboards, watching boots stampede through their kitchen. Her mother's scream, a sound that lived in her marrow, then silence. Morning brought a neighbor's whisper. They strung him up by his own tree. The sapling, they said, had bent nearly to the ground under his weight, but didn't break. Edith's voice, when it came, surprised her. It sounded like someone else's. "He believed trees could save us." said their roots knit the world together. She nodded at the window. That one, it grew from blood and shame. You think that's why folks tie their ribbons? To apologize to the dead. Lightfoot didn't answer. Outside, snow began to fall, catching in the oak's branches like forgotten lace. They buried Elijah in secret, her mother insisting no marker. Let them think he vanished, she'd said, scrubbing soot from the floor where the men's boots had ground a cigarette into the wood. But the tree became their headstone. By spring 44, cloth scraps appeared, a handkerchief knotted by the mailman, a scrap from a Sunday dress left by the grocer's wife. Each ribbon a silent "I'm sorry," a "we saw." Edith rose, bones protesting, and opened the bottom dresser drawer. Beneath yellowed linens lay her childhood diary, its cover stained by tea and tears. She pressed it into Lightfoot's hands. "Page 14, she said. The entry, penciled in a child's looping script. April 12, 1944. Mr. Jenkins tied a blue rag today. Mama says don't look. But I seen him cry." Lightfoot's throat worked. When she looked up, her eyes glistened. Why keep silent? Edith studied the snow globe paperweight on her sill. A gift from Elijah's WPA crew, its tiny Chicago skyline frozen under glass. "Silence," she said, "is what you wrap around the raw parts. Let the world think you're whole." But the tree had never been silent. Its leaves whispered in a language only the broken understood. That night, after Lightfoot left with the diary clutched to her chest, Edith bundled herself in her dead husband's overcoat. The walk to the oak took 20 minutes, each step a reckoning. Under its branches, she knelt, not to pray, but to press her palm to roots that had cradled her father's last breath. The ribbons brushed her cheeks like phantom fingers. From her pocket, she drew a hair bow, its pink silk faded to the color of old scars. "For you, Daddy," she whispered, tying it to a low branch. The wind lifted it gently, a pale flutter against the dark. Somewhere down the block, a saxophone mourned through an open window. The notes tangled with the rustle of 1,000 ribbons, weaving a song that sounded almost like forgiveness. Rain fell in sheets the night they burned the tree. Not the gentle drizzle that polished Chicago's skyline into a jeweled grid, but a biblical deluge that turned Bronzeville's streets into rivers. From her perch on the crawlspace floorboards, 7-year-old Edith watched water seep under the kitchen door, carrying with it the stench of kerosene and something sharper, burning sap. The men's voices boomed like distant thunder, their laughter syncopated with the crackle of flames. "Teach him to plant his nigger roots in our dirt." Decades later, the storm lived in Edith's bones. She woke, gasping, her bedroom air thick with the phantom smell of charred wood. Outside, the oak's branches tapped her window, their shadows clawing at the moonlit glass. The ribbons were restless tonight. Mayor Johnson saw the tree differently. Through the rain-streaked window of his SUV, it loomed like a ruined cathedral, its trunk illuminated by the flicker of news vans. The coroner's report, strangulation, rope fibers, had leaked, and now the nation's hunger for the story threatened to swallow the truth whole. A young reporter shouted questions about reparations. An activist waved a bullhorn, demanding the city tear down the monument to hate. Johnson stepped into the downpour, the photo from the tin box burning a hole in his pocket. The crowd parted for Lightfoot. She moved like a woman possessed, her trench coat dark with rain, a folder of documents clutched to her chest. Without a word, she led Johnson to the oak's eastern face, where bark had sloughed away to reveal initials carved deep, EH11/12/43. "Found it this morning," she said, her voice raw. "Same date as the police report." Johnson traced the letters. The tree's flesh beneath was pink, almost alive. "They lynched him here. Carve his name as a joke." Not a joke. Lightfoot's flashlight beam climbed the trunk, catching on a bullet lodged in the wood. .38 caliber, circa 1940s. A receipt. The storm swelled, wind screaming through the branches. Somewhere above, a ribbon snapped free, red fabric whipped into the darkness like a fleeing soul. November 12, 1943. Elijah Hayes stumbled, the noose chafing his neck raw. They dragged him from bed, his daughter's scream still ringing in his ears. The sapling, his sapling, planted just days before with Edith's small hands patting the soil, bent under his weight, its young roots trembling. A match flared. Someone poured gasoline, the liquid pooling around his shoes. "This what you wanted?" A voice sneered. A councilman's son, cheeks flushed with bourbon and entitlement. "A tree to piss on?" The fire took quickly. Flames licked at Elijah's trousers, the heat a second noose. But as smoke blurred the stars, the sapling did something impossible. It held. Years later, a botanist would marvel at the oak's rings. The fire should have killed it. Instead, the scars became armor, the choked sap rerouted through secret channels. By dawn, when Edith crept from her hiding place, the sapling stood blackened but upright, its leaves curled like fists. The storm broke at midnight. Johnson stood alone under the oak, rain soaking through his suit. In his hand, a police roster from 1943, Officer Patrick O'Reilly. Badge number 2145. Died 1988. Survived by grandson, Sean O'Reilly, CEO, Lakefront Development Group. Coincidence had a stench. Lakefront's bulldozers were scheduled to break ground near the oak next month. Lightfoot found him there, her silhouette sharp against the sodium glow of streetlights. She held a magnifying glass over a 1944 Chicago Tribune clipping. Local botanist vanishes. Foul play suspected. The article was 2 paragraphs long, buried between ads for vacuum cleaners and war bonds. "Sean O'Reilly's grandfather signed the death certificate," she said. "Paid off the coroner with a promotion." Johnson stared at the tree. Its branches dripped rainwater onto his scalp, cold as a grave's kiss. Why keep the tree alive? Why not burn it to ash? Lightfoot's smile was a razor. Because monsters love trophies. But the oak had other plans. By 1945, whispers spread through Bronzeville's kitchens and barbershops. That tree's got a spirit in it. Women began leaving ribbons. First a mourner's black silk, then a bride's blue garter. When the Klan returned to chop it down in 47, every axe blade shattered. The foreman quit, muttering about cursed wood. At 3 a.m., Johnson drove to Sean O'Reilly's Gold Coast penthouse. Through the rain, he watched the developer's shadow pace behind linen curtains. He didn't knock. Some truths were better unearthed by daylight. Edith dreamed of roots. They coiled through her bedroom floor, cradling the dried magnolia bloom on her dresser. Her father's voice, warm as soil in July. "See, Bertie, we're all connected under here." When she woke, a single red ribbon lay on her windowsill, damp with rain or tears. Autumn came late to Chicago that year, clinging to the oak's leaves with a stubbornness that mirrored the crowd gathered beneath it. Thousands packed the vacant lot, black grandmothers in church hats, white college students with "I can't breathe" shirts, city workers on lunch breaks, their breath frosting the air in ragged unison. The tree stood central, its branches heavy with ribbons now counted in the thousands, each strip of fabric a stitch in the city's scarred conscience. Edith sat in a folding chair at the base, her hands knotted in her lap like gnarled roots. A nurse had offered a blanket, but she refused. The cold kept her sharp, kept her from dissolving into the memories that swarmed like bees. Around her, cameras buzzed and activists chanted, but the oak's presence dwarfed them all. It had become more than wood, a mirror, a judge, a silent scream given form. Mayor Johnson stood at a makeshift podium, his speech drowned by the wind. He drafted apologies, policy promises, but the words felt ash dry. Instead, he gestured to the tree. "This," he said, voice cracking, "is where we begin." The crowd rippled. A teenager in a hoodie tied a ribbon from his sister's hijab around a low branch. An elderly white man, trembling, hung a Confederate flag cut into strips, afraid surrender. But it was the man in the tailored overcoat who drew silence. Sean O'Reilly's Gucci loafers crunched gravel as he approached, his face a pallid mask. Reporters surged, but Lightfoot blocked them, her stare a warning. Edith didn't blink. She'd seen his face before, in nightmares, in the smirk of the councilman's son as he lit the match. O'Reilly knelt, the weight of his guilt bowing him like a sapling in a storm. From his pocket, he drew a ribbon, white silk, monogrammed PJO, his grandfather's initials. The wind died. When he tied it to the oak, the fabric seemed to sear his fingers. He jerked back, but the crowd's murmurs pressed him forward. "I'm sorry," he rasped, not to Edith, not to the cameras, but to the tree itself. The ribbon flared once, blood red in the setting sun, then faded to bone white. A collective breath released. Someone began singing "Lift Every Voice," the melody spreading until the lot thrummed with it. Edith closed her eyes. The song became her mother's hum as she scrubbed soot from floors, became the saxophone's wail from her girlhood, became the rustle of 1,000 ribbons speaking in tongues. Lightfoot appeared at her side, holding a small box. Inside lay the bullet pride from the oak's trunk, .38 caliber, its nose flattened by decades of growth. "Forensics matched it to O'Reilly's service revolver," she said. "The tree, it carried the proof all along." Edith touched the slug. Cold, yet somehow pulsing. "Like a seed," she murmured. As dusk bled into night, the crowd thinned. Johnson lingered, studying the ribbons, so many they seemed to breathe, a second skin for the oak. Lightfoot joined him, her usual edge softened by exhaustion. "You think this changes anything?" she asked. He nodded to where a young couple helped their daughter tie a pink ribbon. "Not everything, but enough." Edith was last to leave. She pressed her palm to the trunk, feeling the hum of sap through bark. Somewhere above, her childhood hair bough fluttered, its silk whispering secrets to the new ribbons. The oak had swallowed her father's blood, his killer's bullets, the salt of 1,000,000 tears. Now it stood, not as a martyr, but as a living thing, twisted, scarred, impossibly alive. Walking home, she passed the park where Johnson had found the tin box. Backhoes sat idle, their jaws frozen mid-bite. A ribbon fluttered from one's claw, yellow, like the ones her mother used to tie in her hair. That night, the first frost came. It silvered the oak's branches, turned each ribbon to a shard of ice. By dawn, they glimmered like a constellation fallen to earth, a map of pain and pardon written in a language only the brave could read. Spring returned to Chicago as it always did, reluctant, sharp with the memory of frost, but insistent. The oak stood sentinel over Bronzeville, its trunk now encased in a glass and steel frame that glinted like a reliquary. A plaque at its base, weathered to mimic the tin box's rust, bore 2 lines. Elijah Hayes, 1901 to 1943. He rooted us in courage. Around it, the city had carved a plaza of reclaimed brick, each stone stamped with names of the forgotten. Black veterans denied burial. Mothers lost to childbirth in segregated wards. Boys erased by police blotters. Edith's wheelchair faced the tree one final time. At 93, her hands lay folded in her lap. A pink ribbon from her braid wound around her wrist like a vein. The nurse had warned against the chill, but the sun held a conspiratorial warmth. She inhaled damp soil, distant popcorn from a street vendor, the metallic tang of the L train. The same sense as that November night, minus the kerosene. Behind her, the city thrived. Tourists snapped photos of the ribbons, now encased in resin panels that spiraled up the oak's trunk, preserving their frayed edges. A docent recited the legend of the cursed wood to school children, her voice blending with the hum of a nearby coffee cart. Edith's great-granddaughter, Lila, knelt at the plaque, her locks threaded with blue ribbons. At 12, she carried Elijah's chin and Edith's defiant brow. "They're ready, Mama Lila," a park ranger murmured. The crowd parted like a psalm. Mayor Johnson, hair salted now, gripped a shovel's handle. Lightfoot stood beside him, her cane tapping an impatient rhythm. They'd aged into allies, their battles etched in the fund's ledger. Scholarships for black botanists, legal aid for redline families, a clinic where Sean O'Reilly's donations quietly covered prescriptions. The new sapling arrived in a clay pot, its roots bound in burlap. Lila lifted it, her arms trembling not from weight but legacy. The hole had been dug yards from the oak, close enough to share soil, far enough to cast its own shadow. From the original's acorns, the docent whispered as cameras leaned in. But Lila knew better. The sapling was a cutting, grafted from the oak's scorched heartwood, its DNA a helix of survival. She lowered it into the earth, her palms pressing dirt as her great-grandmother had once done. When she stood, her jeans bore twin stains at the knees, a baptism in loam. The crowd surged forward. Ribbons fluttered, vintage silk from elders, neon shoelaces from teens, a nurse's scrubs ribbon tag, Tamir, 2002 to 2014. Lila wove hers into the sapling's guard stake. Pink silk from Edith's braid, its edges frayed by time. At dusk, the plaza emptied. Johnson lingered, tracing the oak's glass shell. Inside, a single .38 slug floated in resin, a seed of truth. Lightfoot joined him, her cane clicking the bricks. "You think they'll remember?" he asked. She snorted. "They'll try to forget. Our job's to make it harder." Edith's nurse found her at moonrise, head tilted toward the oak. In her lap, the magnolia bloom had crumbled to dust. It sent a final exhale. They wheeled her away gently, the ribbons hushed in the wind. Lila returned at dawn. The sapling's leaves glowed tenderly, its branches still too young for scars. From her backpack, she unwrapped Edith's diary, the entry about Mr. Jenkins' blue rag marked with a pressed magnolia petal. She buried it at the sapling's roots, a story to feed the growth. Years later, when the sapling's own branches grew heavy with resin-cased ribbons, tourists would note how its bark spiraled like a double helix. Botanists called it a quirk of grafted DNA. But the barbers and porch elders of Bronzeville knew better. They'd seen Lila, now a woman with her own braided ribbons, guide her daughter's hands to plant a third tree. They'd watched the roots tangle underground, knitting a lattice only the broken could trace. On the anniversary of the planting, the wind would stir both trees, their leaves whispering not just Elijah's name, but Edith's, and Lila's, and the thousands of others etched into the bricks, a chorus of roots binding earth to sky, memory to tomorrow.